Do people know that saying or no?
They should.
Okay, can I say
It's a
it?
toque.
We're the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking about how gun confiscation starts, and we don't have to look any further than America's closest neighbor and America's favorite hat, Canada. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And to start off, gun confiscation takes place, a lot of people see it in movies as being real extreme all at once, but really it's kind of a slow boil on how we get there. And we can look to Canada to see, and this comes off of on the heels of Justin Trudeau's remarks on a freeze on handgun ownership. But we see that this stuff takes place in stages, and we kind of see the beginning of it happening here in the United States, wouldn't you say?
Well, gun confiscation we've always looked at it through this historical context. Yes, totalitarian governments like Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Red China, they do not allow their citizens to own guns, and we think, well, those are totalitarians, those are dictators. We live in a free society. And then even in states that have very restrictive gun laws, like a lot of countries in Europe, Great Britain, Australia, we think that's just simply too far away. They don't have our history. And the thing about it is that whenever we speak of the potentials of all of the gun, wanting to have the gun records and everything else, we can actually see how the anti-gun folks' plans are taking shape simply by looking at Canada.
And I think we can see this happening here in the United States, and it's not hyperbole. And it starts with, first, we want to be able to have access to all the firearms purchase records. Now, what do we have here in the United States that would indicate that this may be happening? Well, it's kind of a twofold thing. The first are the ATF has changed its guidance and directed federal firearms license dealers, gun stores, to preserve 4473's firearms transactions records indefinitely. Prior to this, they only had to keep them for 20 years before most FFLs would discard these records. And if they went out of business in the time that they had these records, they would have to turn them over to the ATF. That's how it used to be. Well, now they're saying you got to keep these records forever, and then it's kind of double penalized. We see the ATF going after and all these enforcement actions against federal firearms license dealers, trying to revoke their licenses, which, kind of has this double effect. One, you got to keep all these records, but also we're going to force you out of business. And then what? You have to turn these records over to us, the ATF.
And what is important to realize is that, this is done somewhat secretive. Because several years ago, a couple of years ago, the ATF actually altered the 4473 itself.
Yep.
It used to be that the 4473 was a 3-page form that had the individual's personal information on the front, and then had the information about what firearms they were purchasing on page 3, I believe. Well, a couple of years ago, the ATF altered the form to have both the person's personal information and the make, model, and serial number of the firearms he was purchasing put on the same piece of paper. Now, what would be the logic behind doing that?
Well, I don't think it takes that many logical leaps to say it's a lot easier to scan a singular page as opposed to 3 pages multiplied by the number of firearms transactions we have in the United States. So I don't think it's a leap to say that's why they're trying to consolidate the information onto a singular record. But it goes a step further. So we know that they're trying to build out, these records, keep these records forever. But we see this push from gun grabbers for what they call universal background checks. And what's, when you hear that term, Edwin, what does that mean to you?
Well, first of all, anytime an anti-gun folks or a person pushing for more gun control says that we want background checks, well, guess what? There are background checks. Background checks currently exist. They've existed for several decades. Every time an individual gets a firearm from an FFL, they must go through a background check. Anytime they get a firearm from an unlicensed dealer, they're committing a crime. And so therefore, the only type of firearms transaction that is not regulated with a background check is a person-to-person transfer of a firearm between individuals who reside in the same state. That's the only one. Even individuals, private individuals who reside in different states have to go through an FFL. So this scope of universal background checks whenever they say that, they're only talking about that specific limited number of person-to-person transactions that occur in the same state.
So you have got to keep your records forever. Once you're out of business, you got to give us your records, and we're going to make sure every firearm is documented with universal background checks. The second one that comes up is the elimination of homemade firearms. Sometimes you hear them called ghost guns, unserialized firearms. They want to ban ghost gun possession and the creation or manufacture of ghost guns, again funneling all firearms through FFLs, which the ATF is trying to run out of business so that they have to turn over their records. Now, what does that make for us at that point when we have every firearm documented and it's all contained on a singular page, and all the ATF has to do is revoke a federal firearms license, and now they have access to all of these records? What do you call that?
We call that a de facto gun registry.
Yeah, and that seems to be the path the ATF is on at this point. And the next step is we see what is happening now in Canada, which is a freeze on handgun ownership. Now, to give us a little bit of historical background, we have seen Canada, and Justin Trudeau fully acknowledges that Canadians don't have a right to self-defense. They don't have a right to keep and bear arms under their constitution or how their governing documents. And so we see a little bit of difference here, but it starts with a freeze, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, and the thing about it is we have seen this in Canada with their version of the so-called assault weapons ban. So what they did was, a few years ago, they said, okay, we are going to stop the importation, the transfer of assault weapons, which they don't have a definition for, but apparently they have created a list of over 1,500 different rifles that they consider to be assault weapons. So they said, we're going to create this ban, but we're not going to criminalize possession. But if you have possession of them, you do have to let us know that you have possession of them, because we've regulated all this other action with them. Well, guess what? 2 weeks ago, they came out and said, we've decided that we're criminalizing possession as well. So how hard do you think it's going to be for them to track down the individuals who said, I've currently got one, who 3 years ago said, I've got one, just letting you know I have it. Now, they, of course, have banned possession.
Yeah, so they go from freeze to criminalization, voluntary turn in your guns, and then the last step, confiscation. And they know who has these guns. And now this is, a lot of people will say, hey, this is hyperbolic. This wouldn't happen in the United States. We have the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court, and even, maybe we have a conservative majority in the federal government at some point that might put the brakes on this. But it appears to be that this is the direction that the country is going in.
And the thing about it is, the Canadians use the exact same rhetoric that the anti-gun folks here in America use. Oh, this is sensible. It's common sense. Why would you be opposed to this? Only people who want to kill children would oppose this.
And it starts with this is a step one. We've heard that rhetoric, and they're putting this framework together in the Senate right now. But what we still see from gun grabbers is, well, this is a good first step. And they're not going to be satisfied until all guns are eliminated in the United States, which is a real uphill battle. We have hundreds of millions of firearms in the United States, but this is the process that it goes through and how we get there. First, you build the database, then you make everybody funnel their transactions through FFLs, then you freeze, and then you criminalize and confiscate. And it seems to be the path we're on.
And they're always critical of us gun supporters because they claim that we are not willing to compromise. But what do we say about compromise, Richard?
Yesterday's compromise is today's loophole. And that's exactly what we see with, private transactions between residents of the same state. The rationale behind that was, the federal government doesn't have the ability to regulate commerce between interstate commerce, intrastate commerce between residents of the same state. Well, today, that's a loophole. Well, we hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video. We always appreciate your questions and comments below. And until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.